Welcome, Samuel. Great to see you.
Hi, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start our presentation today by reminding us all of the beautiful land that we live on here in Maine and to pay respect. Portland Ovations acknowledges that the places where we gather, dance, and sing is ancestral Wabanaki land. We wish to pay respect to the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and their elders, past, present, and future. And I always like to have a little pause after that because I think it's a moment to reflect and just to really think and let those words sink in. I know Sarah made a point yesterday of saying that they're words and there's action that follows. And I think a lot of the conversations we've been having in Ovations is about what are the actions that follow our words and how do we live into our words. And what I love, actually, Linda was mentioning this a minute ago, but all of the artists, there's such diversity in the artists that we are commissioning right now. And there's so many different ideas and identities and processes that everybody brings forward. So today we're on day 5. We started the week with choreographer Riley Watts. We had playwright Dee Clark. We had musicians and writer Karem Durdog and Andy Happel. And then we had Star Kelly from the Abbey Museum. And today we have a master musician, a contributor to The Moth, a regular contributor to Black Girl in Maine, and also has appeared in the Huffington Post. You are I said master musician, but also an incredible songwriter. So anything I left out? And I know you have a performance background as well, so that comes through. But just when we think about all of those pieces, I mean, I know what I think of when I think of that. I think of storyteller, at the heart of who you are. So tell me for you how all these different art forms tie together into the identity of Samuel James.
um, well, it's yeah. So I was raised here in Maine. My father is from Tucson, and his father and all the generations before are from East Texas, as far back as through slavery, and then nobody knows before that because it's all receipts and not birth certificates. But we were all sort of raised with just expression, and so it wasn't necessarily music and then storytelling and then et cetera, et cetera. It was all just kind of one thing. So my father started teaching me music at age 5 with drums, 8 with piano, 9 with trombone, and right on through. Well, my father was also, he knew how to hold court. On the other side of my family, on my mother's side, my grandfather was actually the sheriff of York County. And that was a political office. So he knew how to hold court too. So storytelling and my grandmother was also a musician. My grandfather on my mother's side was he was a fiddler he was actually a fiddler in the military, and he was a fiddler for the military in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. So just musical expression, writing, every kind of expression was just culturally brought up in my house.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting thinking about the conversation yesterday with Star Kelly and the centrality of storytelling to Native populations and communities, and that it's not something that lives over here. It's not simply a folklore or myth. It's not about myth and folklore. It's really central, and I'm hearing that from you too in terms of it being central to your identity of how you, like you say, express yourself. It's not something that lives next to you. It's inside of you. Is
Yeah.
that something that is something are you challenged by as an artist to have that much in you to share? I wonder.
I think it's like people who were born kind of bilingual, or raised bilingual. It's not a thing you necessarily think about. For me anyway, it's not a thing that I necessarily consider. In I think the same capacity as you're saying, like as like an aside to myself. But I think that storytelling itself there's like an indigenous quality to that I think gets lost sometimes. I know with music, there's a thing with I have a bunch of instruments behind me, but maybe I'll wait. there's an idea of storytelling that is indigenous that gets lost with like Western interpretations. So as an example, like in classical music, the instruments are often the voice, right? And indigenous music, Native music, Black American music, the voice is the voice, right? So you're telling a story and the music is just the means to dance to the story you're being told. And so the music comes as this sort of guide as opposed to the actual point necessarily, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that that's how I was raised to think of it, as just there's a voice and then there's a means by which you can project your voice.
Well, I love that distinction you just made about the voice and how in some art forms the voice comes through an instrument, and that yet in other art forms it's coming through the actual human body, and that really deep connection
Yeah.
that means with the humanity of it, that this is really about the person, and you can feel that in such a deep way. One of the things I left out in your biography is that you're also a music educator.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's another, I mean, to me, that's another form of storytelling and obviously another way of connecting. And one of the things that's been so powerful about working with all you artists is that through this process is that we get to work with you in different ways at different times. And so I would love if you could share with folks a little bit, and we're gonna get more into the commissioning project in a minute, but I'd love if you could take a moment to talk about what you are doing also with Ovations at this time.
Oh, the educational part.
That I'm not
So
going to mess up. So I'm going to let you
you let me do it. Okay.
say.
Yeah, I've created it's a video project for K through 5 students, and it's about educating children about music, but about a little bit of history. It revolves around a character named Tiny Bill McGraw, who's existed in my songs before, and he's a child who uh, doesn't like being tiny, and he goes to his grandfather to seek counsel, and his grandfather teaches him um, that you can be big with sound. And then from there, we learn about the history of different instruments, the history of sort of folk music in Black America. It's set roughly around in the 30s, so it's all contemporary, and it all kind of revolves around trains.
Mm. And this is something that you've created for us that's going to be available for young audiences, both it'll be in schools and for families.
Yeah, yeah.
Fantastic.
It's K
So,
through 5, but it's for everybody.
but for everybody. So with all of this, let's get into a little bit about what is your creative process. Again, knowing that you're writing for song, you're writing for the stage, you're writing for the page. What is the process through which you generate work?
Oh, it depends on the project. If I'm writing, for, let's say, Mainer or Black Girl in Maine, a lot of times that's just me wandering around my apartment and yelling curse words real loud until it comes out more eloquent, and then I sit down and type it out. If I am writing music, a lot of music exploration, it's a lot more exploration to me. It's a lot more about trying to find the right sound. There's a difference in hmm, there's an indigenous view of music that has a lot more to do with uh, the actual sound of it than it does like the academic process of it. So, for instance, writing it down, right? Music is not actually meant to be written down. Music is meant to be heard. The same with any language, you learn to speak a lot longer than before you learn to write it. In most cases. And so like that, I view music and most creation in that way. It's about the experience of coexisting with it, right? And trying to get inside of it. I think about that a lot with the term of like what home is for this project, right? The idea of home being, I know for myself, I feel most at home when I am creating. And so on a stage, I know I try to create as much as I can live on stage, improvise as much as I can, and try to create that kind of home and hopefully make it home enough that I can bring the audience into this home that I'm creating in this moment. And so all of it is a pursuit for that for me. All of it is a pursuit to try to create this home.
Well, and I love what you just said about that for you, home is that creative space and creating that creative space. And as soon as you said that, I started thinking, well, okay, then what does he do when he's on stage? You know, how do you recreate the creation, right? In terms of
Yeah.
creating space for you too, because it's, I mean, I think that what's so exciting about for me with live performance especially is that connection between the artist and the audience. And so how do you bring that energy that I've been at performances where you don't feel like you're part of you're not part of it at all. I mean, musicians might even have their back to you. And
Yeah.
let me in. And to just to think about how you are approaching that and creating that space so that everybody can feel at home in that space. It reminds me of a conversation I had with somebody in our community last year, 2 years ago, and it was a member of the New Mainer community, and they were making the comment that it didn't matter that their language or their culture was on stage. It mattered that the space that was created, everybody felt welcome and everybody wanted to be part of that global community. And it was such an eye-opener to me just to think about that space and that container that artists create for us to be part of. Do you feel with that, especially with the music that you're working on right now and that theme of home, can you go a little bit deeper into what you're examining as home beyond
Yeah.
the space, but really the identity and the place and space of home?
Yeah. I think about what you just said and the idea of like creating the space where everybody's welcome. And I think a trick of that for me is that like the art forms that I am involved in, especially Black American folk music, it very much revolves around not being able to create that space at all. It's about creating an art in a space that specifically does not welcome you and tries to kill you,
And it's been denied and denied and denied and denied.
Yeah. I think there's a guy named Son House who was one of the originators of this music. The difficulty in talking about this music is that it predates recording technology. So we only can experience as much as was like the 1920s and past. Each of the people that you hear in the 1920s like had huge careers before recording and had performances that were probably the greatest things you will never hear. But one of the people at the beginning of that era was a guy named Son House. And Son House's stories of his life, I think explain really perfectly like where this music comes from, where this art comes from. He had a story where he went to the woman he was living with didn't feel well. And he was like, I'm going out. Do you want to come out? And she didn't want to come out. So he went out and he came back later and she still wasn't feeling well. And then they went to sleep. And then he woke up in the morning and she wasn't beside him. And he went to the outhouse and she was in the outhouse and she had died in the night. And so his reaction to that was to pack all of his belongings and leave, just leave her there. And the reason for that is because if you were a Black man at that period of time and there was a dead body, you were going to pay the price. So the one thing he could do to preserve his own life is to abandon everything. And to me, that's like, it's a very difficult thing to try to explain that, I think, to people in contemporary life, the idea that like the art you're creating from a point of view of somebody who could be gone at any moment. And every moment it's precious, but it's not precious in a way where you're sitting there and you're like, this is a very precious moment. It's precious in the fact that it could always be your last, and you're living in this sort of constant cultural PTSD, and so it's important to me to, I've been very fortunate to not live like that, and so it's important to me to bring that across as much as possible. There's an immediacy to that that exists in, I think, a lot of folk art. Yeah, I feel like I really went off course for your question though.
That's okay. Well, but it's all part of understanding who you are as a human and then as an artist, to know these are the stories that you have resonated for you and that you reflect upon when you're creating and when you're living. I mean, that's the other thing, is that separating Samuel James the artist and Samuel James the man obviously is not, you are one and the same. So just
I hope
to
so. That guy owes me a lot of money.
most of the times. Well, and this is not a question I necessarily intended to talk about, but you and I've talked about it, is you are also a touring artist.
Back when you could do that, yeah.
And you can do that. So maybe just to share with folks, and really and I think the way it connects to this conversation too, in this work, is that our intention at Ovations at this time was to create this commissioning opportunity, because artists like you weren't able to tour and make the money that you normally would make. So maybe just give people a little glimpse of what it means to be an artist who normally would be touring and is not able to do that right now.
Yeah. Oh, it's wild. It's wild because, like in the beginning of this whole thing, back in like the end of March, like April 1st, I was supposed to be in London, and maybe like 3 days before or something, it got canceled. And that was the first one that got like canceled. And then like a few more, and then all of a sudden you just watch. So I book out a year in advance. So I already know what my entire year is going to be like. And I'm very, like, as an artist, that is rare in my experience, to get to a place where you can do that and sort of have that kind of security and like what your year is going to be. There's going to be cancellations, there's going to be problems along the way, but like a vague idea of what your year is going to be is a real blessing. And so you watch it sort of chip away and fall away, and then it all falls. And then like there's still some people hanging on, and you're like, well, maybe I won't go back to that place if you're still hanging on that tightly. So it's shocking. Nobody was in a good place when we all watched it happen, but it's shocking to watch. The other part of it that's, maybe this is too inside baseball, is that every gig you get is imagine performing, imagine doing a job interview and filling out a resume for every day you work. And that's what it is to do this. So it's just a lot of background work that goes into, and a lot of process and a lot of administration, a lot of all this stuff. And then you just watch it all go away. And it's not like, we'll reschedule you. No, it's just blank. And you just have to like, and I know this is the same on your end. You have the exact same opposite side of the coin for this. And so personally, I'm just very thankful that people on your end of it have scrambled as much as you have to like try to figure out a way to keep us all afloat. I'm very thankful for it. But it's, yeah, I mean, we have talked about this, like it's the same on your end, where you're planning hotels, you're planning like all these things for people. And then
Well, and it's interesting too, because I was just part of this past weekend, and a bunch of the national conference happened virtually, of course, and there's a lot of conversation about how to rebuild the field of live performance. And it really started with what happened with COVID, and the partnership between artist and presenter, and how many cancellations you got, and nobody paid you for those cancellations, or very few people paid you for those cancellations, I imagine.
No, zero.
Right. So you were some zero out. And so there's a lot of conversation, and then there was the murder of George Floyd, and so then that added to questions of equity. And it was so interesting to see what's happening as a field, to think about what does rebuilding look like, and how do we reimagine ourselves from a place of equity, where when like a pandemic happens, it's not on the back of the artists, that we all have to figure out how to make sure that this ecosystem we've created is not so fragile, and it's the artists who pay for it. Stay tuned. But I shouldn't say stay tuned, because the artists are you and artists are part of the conversation. That's part of it, is just to figure this out, because like you said, it all kind of disappeared very quickly.
Yeah, it's wild to watch it, because like on my end, there's sort of, everybody's still in flux. So the ground is still shaking. Like some people, some presenters would like you to do a live stream like this, like we're doing right now, a conversation. Someone should do a live stream show. Other people, they realize their technology is not as consistent to desire that. So last week I recorded 2 live shows and sent the files out, and those will air where they air. And then I'll jump on afterwards to do a conversation about them. Just like everything is still in flux. And I want to like really say that like, I am one of the very lucky ones, right? There's part of the thing I think we're not talking about enough is that, so how I came up is I had a job at a cultural hub in town in Portland called Videoport, and everybody came into Videoport, and the boss, the owner, Bill Duggan, let me put a flyer in every bag that went out. So just by numbers, I would sell out a show, and because I wasn't terrible, people would come back, right? So this is the advice I used to give to people when they would start as musicians. Like, I was like, get a job at a cultural hub, get a job at a cafe, put a sticker for your show on every cup, like do like, get your voice out as much as you can. But that's not happening. There's no artists developing right now. And we're going almost to a year with no new artists developing. And like, to me, that's something that's going to really affect us in the future. I don't think that we're thinking about enough. So I'm very thankful to you all and to everybody else who's really scrambling to like keep us afloat as much as we are, because without you, we're going backwards.
Well, and I'd also just mention one of our partners right now that's also supporting you in your work, which is Indigo Arts Alliance. You are going into residence with them as well. So I know there's, the Portland community, and again, big shout out to Indigo Arts Alliance, are finding ways to support artists in this moment, at this time, in the ways that make sense too. I think that's the other thing, is to really, make sense of it all. So I want to return to the work. I know you and I, we have these conversations and we end up way over here. So I'm going to bring us back for a minute in terms of the new work that you're creating. If you could just give us a sense of the new work and what you hope it will leave our audiences with. What are you hoping audiences will take away from this new work you're creating as part of this commissioning project?
Yeah, so the work is kind of a return to a project I started a few years ago that became untenable in the moment. And it's big with the idea of home. The idea is that I'm creating music that is influenced by my cultural background, which is to say that it's white traditional music and Black traditional music. And there's takes on traditional songs, and I'm essentially taking these songs that are, so let me give you a little bit of background as much as I can without going too far back. There are a lot of traditional songs that there's an argument in the traditional music communities over who started it, right? This is an old Black traditional, this is an old white traditional. I'm doing takes on these songs that are that I'm using instruments that are thought of as owned by both to do these takes that I feel that I'm in a unique position to do. Some of the I'm gonna grab an instrument real quick.
The banjo. I feel like there's a banjo moment coming.
We can definitely start with the banjo. So the banjo, a lot of people think of as like hillbillies on a porch someplace, Deliverance, right? People think about that all the time. But the banjo is actually an African instrument. And something I'm trying to explore in what I'm recording is that something happened between the time that it arrived as a gourd on the shores of America to the time we think of it in, hillbillies in Kentucky. Like, it's a specific sign of a very specific kind of white supremacy, this African instrument. And something happened along the way, and that's what I'm trying to explore in the recording. So there's a type of playing which is all downstrokes, which is often called claw hammer, but it was also at one point called slave style. So you think of that, and you probably think of hillbillies, right? You probably think of like shirtless overalls. But the reality is that there's somewhere in there that working classes combined, and music got traded, instruments got traded, ideas got traded. And there's also a lot of, yeah, I feel like I'm going to go so deep into this right now. It's
I
going
know,
to
and I'm
alienate
like, and I'm
people.
realizing what time it is. So this is,
Yeah.
but this is what we get to talk about next at a future date. But I also want to just touch on what you're talking about too, because it feels like it also goes back to identity, which is for you also this, Black identity going back to Texas, and your white identity here in Maine, and now you've also have your music also dealing with that duality also, which is really powerful.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Like the trick in digging into this is that what it is to be Black and what it is to be white, as we understand them, as we speak about them colloquially, are like vastly different things. Like there is a Black identity that has to do with art, and there's a white identity which is not. Like a white identity is like, white is a classification of privilege, right? Like white is, I try to explain this with food sometimes. Like I can tell you that I grew up eating a specific kind of food from the bayou that my father started cooking, that he learned from his father. But my father grew up in Tucson, so his food had these Mexican spices. So I grew up in Maine eating a East Texas food that was created with Western spices, right? But that is a Black food. Like anywhere you go in America and you eat this particular kind of food, you're gonna say that's soul food, that's a Black food. You can't do that with white. You would never confuse like English food with Italian food. Right? Because white is this other classification. So trying to dig into what white music is very hard, because it comes from all these folk traditions, and there's not really such a thing. You would never confuse like an Irish sea chanty with like, I don't know, a Russian dirge. Like you just wouldn't, they don't sound the same.
Well, as somebody just said in the chat, that sounded like the beginning of exactly the kind of deep dive so many of us need. There's no question we have to do a next chapter, and maybe it's even one before we get to the next work in progress, which is part of the next part of the series, but maybe there's yet another conversation. It's probably also, it sounds like some of the things that might come through in the education program that you're doing as well. I mean, these are some of the stories that are embedded in that. Speaking of education, hello. It's really live. Okay, so throw me off. We do have a couple of other questions that came up that I want to make sure we honor before we go off. And let's see, so what advice would you give to new musical artists or new bands during this time of COVID who are trying to get their footing with recording and getting their music out? You just touched on the cultural hub piece.
Yeah. Well, I think the trick is you need to go where people are, and right now the only place people are is the internet. And so I think the trick is you need to find a space where what you're doing is different than other people, and it could just be your approach. It doesn't have to necessarily be your music. In fact, it doesn't have to be your music. It has to be your approach and how you're getting in front of people. I remember back in like the early 2000s, there was a band named OK Go, and they got huge on the internet because they made these outrageous videos.
Videos, right?
Yeah, and like I could tell you every single video. I would be hard pressed to like recite a lyric.
But I can imagine them on that treadmill.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that their music is forgettable. I'm saying that even I, as a person who is not a fan of that style of music necessarily, knows who they are. They did an incredible job, and I think, unfortunately, you're just in a position where you need to think three-dimensionally about it, and go where the people are.
Yeah, or fourth dimension, it feels like we're in at this point. One last question, and this is a big one. So I'm just mindful of time. How have you been approaching this year with writing and performing during a pandemic and Black Lives Matter discussions?
How have I been approaching the year? I mean,
performing.
Yeah, I guess as thoroughly as I can, I've been writing a lot. I have, you said this all in the beginning, I have a monthly column for Mainer that's called Racisms for MainerNews.com. I am a staff writer for Black Girl in Maine. So I'm doing as much commentary on it as possible. I'm letting as many people know the viewpoint that I have as a Black person in America and in Maine. And I'm making as much music as possible. I'm trying to stay, I think like everybody, I'm just trying to stay as mentally grounded as I can. And honestly, like there's obviously huge differences. But I think you and I were talking about this before too, like if you are an artist or you're a presenter or you are involved in any sort of like arts business, um, every year you're reinventing yourself in some way. So I've been very fortunate enough to have reinvented myself enough times in my approach to all of this that this is by no means like an easy thing, and I don't recommend it for anybody. We're all going through it. And feel like I have a little bit of experience in reinvention anyway. And so this isn't as, I think it's not as big a jump from the outside as I think it seems maybe for a lot of people. Again, not easy, not great. I don't welcome it, but I think, having the mind, this goes back to, I think, artists as well, finding an audience is that you have to have the mind of like, this is something that I'm going to do, and people are doing it. So it's not impossible for me.
And not to trivialize it to the struggling artists, but artists have always figured out a way. I mean, that's part of what we rely on you for, to help us see and understand. And when times are hard and times are tough, when we're having a lot of questions about each other and who we are in the world, that's what art's for. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry for running over. I feel like I was told this was a half hour, and I thought, I mean, they don't know what they're getting into. This got to be 4 hours long.
Well, like I said, we will figure out a way to continue this conversation and not wait 3 months to do it, because I think, again, there's been several questions. We got to most of them. Would you play us out with the resonator, with the resonating guitar?
Sure.
And somebody just mentioned a 4-hour conversation would be welcome. So you and I will figure that out. And I'm going to, if you don't mind, are you okay with this? Like, we didn't ask you to, this was not to play today.
I'd be doing this if we weren't here right now.
Well, I was saying that to Meryl earlier. You might just have it in your lap. So if you'll play us out, we will use this as the opportunity to say goodbye and thank you to everybody. And this is not the last conversation with Samuel James. And thank you, Meryl, and thank you, Sarah, for your help today. Very great for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody.